you so much, everyone, for joining us. Ryan, how about you give us a quick introduction and why you're here today?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a director of engineering at InVision. For those of you who don't know, InVision is a fully distributed, 100% everyone works from home organization. I lead a team of about 60 folks inside InVision, one of the four engineering departments at the company. I've been in the web industry for about 20 years now. I can't believe that number is out there. Working remotely for 15 of those years. And InVision is my third fully distributed company and startup that I've worked for. And I joined InVision about 4.5 years ago when we were about 100 people. And we're over 700. So I've been there as we've scaled this fully remote thing. And yeah, how about you, Shannon?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's nice to have somebody who has been fully remote and understands what it's like for fully remote, because we're getting a lot of questions already about that. But just quickly for me, I am Shannon Hogue. I work at a company called Karat. And my job is great at Karat. It's my job to help companies develop a structured interview process that aligns to their hiring bars, identifies and assesses core competencies, and gets the most predictive signal out of each interview. And we need to do that at scale through remote interviews. And so I'm here today just to first ask you a lot of questions, but I'll also add some comments as time goes on if people want to ask about interviewing remotely or continuing the hiring process. Awesome. So I guess let's start with, how are you feeling? How's your team feeling during this crazy time that we're in?
Yeah, it's interesting. People keep asking me this question, like, has anything really changed for you? Because you're fully remote, And I think we're really fortunate that a lot of our working mechanics have gone unchanged at this time. But certainly I don't think any of us are unaffected by what's going on in the world right now. A lot of us, we have kids at home. I've got 2 kids at home myself. And now we're sort of all dealing with new distractions. Not only are we suddenly working full-time at home, but we're also caretakers, and now many of us are educators. So trying to deal with a lot of those new distractions is kind of difficult for a lot of us. And I think the other thing too is fully remote organizations, you're already kind of isolated. So a lot of us do things outside our homes to fight that social isolation, and a lot of that's cut off from us right now. So we're just trying to figure out this thing, same as everybody else, having these kinds of conversations a lot, and trying to stay connected to everybody at work. A lot of story sharing. I was telling Shannon yesterday, I think our most popular channel inside Slack right now is our COVID-19 channel. People just sharing information, personal stories, their own experiences. It's just been really valuable to everybody.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. What other measures are you taking or thinking about taking during the crisis to help support folks who are remote for the first time, or they're going through a pandemic for the first time, their kids are at home, they're not sure how to handle daycare, for example?
Yeah, it's interesting because you're sort of how would you handle this in a non-pandemic situation, right? And, you see people who might be distracted at work, or performance might be suffering. We're going to do the same thing we normally do as managers and kind of talk to them and kind of find out, what's going on in their personal lives. Do they need to take some time off right now to figure out a new schedule, figure out, their new routines at work, right? Take an hour in the beginning of the day to kind of deal with the kids. And I know between my wife and I, we have to figure out our schedule for educating the kids in the morning, a couple of hours, and then letting them run amok in the afternoon, just because they need to get that energy out. But trying to find those new schedules are challenging for folks. So working with them one-on-one and kind of making it work, right?
Yeah, for sure. And Jean actually is asking a question around that. How has your management techniques changed during the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I was going to say not too dramatically, although I think we're spending a lot more time, making sure people feel safe at work, talking a lot more about, our financial stability at the company, their standing at the company, just making sure people know that, we're going to figure this out. Like, we don't necessarily know how this is going to impact the economy and how it's going to impact the company, but make sure we're vocally having those conversations and doing a lot to, again, like, just share, this is how I'm feeling about it, and hopefully give people an outlet to be able to talk about it. I mean, we've seen a lot of folks are just like, I just want to focus on work.
Yeah,
It's like,
right?
don't ask me about these things. Like, this is a worthy distraction for me right now, because all the other burdens in my life, I want this thing I can focus on here. So I think they said everybody's sort of different, and we got to kind of work out exactly what each person needs.
Yeah, there's a lot of acceptance there when you're talking, and what we're doing at Karat, our co-founders are wonderful. They've allocated an hour every week on Friday for folks to join and have an open conversation about, things outside of work, their childcare needs or how they're feeling. Some folks are not very good with isolation, and pandemics can be quite scary, and they're worried about their families that are remote. And so I think having those open channels and understanding, and of course, it seems as if you're letting your teams know that you're also dealing with the same things, and they can commiserate in a sense.
Yeah, those have been really great sessions for us at InVision, as well as sort of calling a town hall just to talk about COVID-19 and the impact there. And I think our first call, we had over 150 people join. And honestly, like, you got 150 people on a call, like, you're not going to hear from everybody, but just hearing, one or two stories from folks about how they're dealing with, like you said, childcare or education, or even just, some are like now have to deal with their parents or their grandparents who don't quite understand how this kind of works and have to figure out technology. And just hearing them tell those stories have helped foster a sense of community around this within the company.
I love that. We have another question from Samantha. Do you have any advice for managers starting at a new company while remote? What are some of the best practices for getting to know your new team while remote and during this crisis?
Yeah, this is a great question. And, you see some folks can have a tendency to get on a stand-up call or a sprint planning session and jump right into business, right? And we were just talking about that earlier, even on interviews, trying to take those moments between meetings or at the very beginning of a meeting, very end of a meeting, and just have social conversations and ask questions about what's going on. Like, what are they going to do this weekend? Are they having any trips planned that didn't get disturbed in this whole pandemic? Try to take those opportunities to socialize. And when you're a manager, you have to be intentional about finding times to do those things and fostering that. One thing that I like to do on my staff meetings is, we've done a lot of things like house tours, for example. Pick up your laptop and show me your home, right? Or tell me about your family history. You were saying hey, when did you get into your career? That's a great one of what was your career journey? If you've ever heard the term journey lines, we've done journey lines for everyone in the team, and it's just gone a long way to foster more of a social connection and get to know folks that isn't the day-to-day, right? And that's important, especially remote. Building that connection is going to build empathy between you and the rest of the team and your coworkers. And it's you can't have a real good foundation of trust without that empathy and that connection.
Yeah, and I think, as Samantha was asking, I think that's especially important in your first days as a new manager in a remote world, is really, I guess one follow-up question that I would have is, it's really easy to blur those lines. How some folks will feel it's a little bit invasive for you to kind of, interrogate into their personal lives. So how do you manage that process in a remote environment, it's often a little bit more difficult to see those emotional cues or social cues that you would see in person. So do you have any tips or feedback on how they can manage that piece?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, it's worth calling out that it's, our responsibility to make sure that if anyone's not comfortable sharing personal details, like you should definitely make sure that they know that. I will say, like, as a leader, sometimes you're going to set the standard here, right? So if you are, going first in these exercises and sharing certain things about your personal life, that's going to be how you kind of build that, we were talking earlier, the sort of work-life integration. This is a term we use a lot in fully distributed companies. It's kind of part of the cultural DNA of a fully distributed company. Like, you can't help but be staring into other people's homes every single day, right? Like, this is my home office. I mean, my kids is gonna come in, like, that just happens, and you have to sort of accept that this is, there is not a lot of separation between work and life in a fully distributed organization. So kind of embracing that has definitely become a new norm for a lot of people. And I quite frankly find really refreshing, because it's, like you said, you learn new things about the folks that you work with just by having that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So Noah is asking, how do you optimize engineering teams that are distributed across many time zones that are all dependent on each other, specifically when there's a specific domain knowledge, when there are specific domain knowledge dependencies?
This is a great question for distributed teams. And honestly, like, there's no real perfect answer for solving the, fully distributed time zones.
Yeah.
I will say, what I've learned is that people are really good at understanding the difference in time between their time zone and one other time zone.
That's true.
Like, if you can standardize on one time zone for the team or the hopefully the company, and say, like, listen, like, everyone is going to use East Coast time zone. So if we are sharing some information and there's a timestamp on it, assume that this is East Coast time zone. Otherwise, like, put a time zone on it, because, like I said, like, it's a lot easier for people to orient around that. And then even, like, when they're communicating, remember, oh, okay, yeah, it's 5 hours back from, London, right? So now I know kind of exactly what to say there. One of the things that we've done is sort of establish in that standard time zone, what are the, like, hours of overlap that are necessary for the whole team to be around.
Right.
So if it's 4 hours, 5 hours, I definitely recommend, like, between 4 or 5 seems to be a good amount of time, depending on, like, how meeting heavy culture or meeting heavy the culture is. And then really just, like, help people adjust their schedules according to that, right? And recognize that some folks, if you're on a complete opposite time zone, they're going to have to make some adjustments, but you kind of need that interaction or you won't be effectively collaborating. I mean, Zoom and video connections are, like, you can't replace this by having asynchronous communication all the time. You're going to miss all those cues that you're talking about. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about time zones. When you're talking about, domain knowledge and sharing those kinds of dependencies, one of the things that we do a lot is, if you're going to be collaborating on a particular subject, we recommend doing that around an artifact, right? Okay. So, like, having a document of some kind, if that's like a freehand, like, collaborative whiteboard or a prototype or a Google Doc of some kind, some document that is, like, sort of this rule of, like, no empty canvas, right? Like, don't show up to a meeting or don't, like, be collaborating in a void, because you're not going to get the same amount of collaboration when you do have FaceTime together, right?
Right.
When you do get a meeting, having something as, like, a jumping off point is going to help you. And obviously, like, having folks write these things down is also going to help them shape their thinking around it. So when you do, get folks together, you've got this document, and that kind of serves as your like organizational memory as well. Cause like, I'm sure many of us are working in Slack right now. I've seen the Slack numbers from the CEO being shared. Like, can't believe how crazy growth that they're having right now. But I think, was it Jason Fried said, like, the best analogy I saw with Slack is it's like a conveyor belt of information that is just moving away from you at any given time, right? So unless you're like at your station at all times, you're not going to catch up on all of that. So that's again why like we don't do a lot of collaboration around specific topics or where there's like specific domain knowledge or dependencies in a medium like Slack, where your asynchronous folks coming in at different time zones have to like plug in and kind of read back.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a follow-up question maybe, do you have any tools that you would suggest? I know earlier you spoke about a tool called Freehand, and that's something that you're using?
Yeah, that's an InVision product. It's a collaborative whiteboarding tool. I think, there's a lot of great real-time collaborative tools out there that folks are using. Freehand's one, Google Docs, obviously people are using that a lot. The theme that I tell people is like a couple of things that are necessary for it to be effective working as a collaborative tool remotely. One is like be able to screen share. So be able to screen share through Slack or through the Zoom, but then also take the document link or whatever this thing is, drop it into the chat or drop it into Slack, and let people not just follow along inside, the Zoom meeting, but also explore the document on their own on their own screen and their own computers. Because more often than not, when we're collaborating around something, it's like we don't take in information the same way. Some people can like take information that's presented, and some just kind of need that, like, I would just want to read this document really quick on my own and kind of pull the pieces out. And so really it's like, if you can find a tool that allows you to present and follow someone else, explore the document together, and then like real-time edit inside of that, that's going to be an effective tool for remote collaboration.
I love that. Awesome. Andre is asking, how do you handle onboarding of new team members that they're engaged and so that they're engaged and feel included in the team?
Yeah. So I'll answer this question. I'm sure you get a lot of questions about onboarding too.
I do, quite a bit.
Yeah. Couple of things that we do. One is have an onboarding buddy. Now, this is a person that their whole responsibility is to get this new hire up to speed and productive and engaged. Typically, you're connecting this person like a week ahead of time. Mm-hmm. And even Christian mentioned last week in his AMA, like the importance of getting your IT setup done well before the first day, so that on your first day, first hour, your onboarding buddy is on Zoom, with you, and then talking through this sort of, we've created an onboarding checklist of, here are all the systems you're going to need to set up. Here are the people you're going to want to meet. Here's a lot of documentation that you're going to read. That's one thing, like working remotely, there's usually a lot of docs to grok, and which ones are important to read now versus later. So again, it's like, have that person be there and then make sure they stay connected to the person, like at least a Zoom meeting every single day, and get them engaged.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one thing that also comes to mind for our teams is consistency, really. So consistency in the onboarding experience, consistency of language, really making sure that everyone has the same understanding of how they're being measured as far as success is concerned. So, developers in particular, they they love understanding what the expectations are so that they can meet them, right? So some sort of success metrics and measurements across the organization. And then use the same terminology. So for internal teams, agree on product and development roadmaps and present them to new folks who are coming on board in a consistent manner, right? Make sure everybody understands what the company priorities are and what they'll be working on. Make sure they understand who to communicate with for, what piece of information that they're looking for. And then, again, I think the most important is making sure everybody is speaking the same language when they're communicating about their progress, about status or obstacles, and they understand what those success expectations are.
Yeah, a lot of, especially folks who are new to remote, a lot of our like onboarding training is specifically, here's a bunch of resources to read about effectively managing yourself as a remote worker, and what is it, how do we do it specifically at our company? What are the tips and tricks that you're going to need to know, and how we manage Slack channels and things like that. We were mentioning, I think even Christian was mentioning last week about a lot of companies, InVision included, we have like a structured learning course that new hires will go into, and it's maybe like, depending on the number of new hires that you have at any given time, like you might do it every 2 weeks or like once a month, where there's a week set aside, and you are, to your point, like taking all the folks that are new to the company across all of the different functions, right? Sales, marketing, support, putting them into this like cohort, and then doing a training course where they're learning about like the product, the company mission, the core values, how to be effective at work, like all of those main threads. If you can build like a course around that, it's a really effective way of, again, even just driving engagement. Because I can tell you a lot of folks who have come into InVision, they cite that session as like one of the first foundations of how they made connections to other folks inside the company, because they did it not just one-on-one or alone with their manager, they did it with a group of people all at once.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Rafael is asking, in these times of social isolation, tracking teams' morale and keeping it high while we're working at home is a huge challenge. Which would you say are the main tools and processes that work successfully to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, so tracking morale, tracking engagement, we utilize tools like Culture Amp that allow you to do these cultural surveys, and we do them on a periodic basis. In times like this, and even like between Culture Amp and outside of Culture Amp, one of the things that I like to do to sort of keep track of morale and engagement is utilize one-on-ones as a way of asking specific engagement level questions that kind of get to the heart of like where their morale is at, where their head's at, or how they're feeling about their peers, how they're feeling about the company. One of the tools that I use, if you've ever heard of the Gallup Q12, have you ever heard these questions? They're like 12 questions that the Gallup organization put together about the highest performing teams. They rate highly on these 12 questions. I've actually used those questions in like one-on-ones, like take one question, like how are you feeling about the company confidence right now, for example, and just orienting a single one-on-one around this question will give folks an opportunity to even just think about how they are thinking about their engagement, or how they're, how they think about the company confidence. And that's like a conversation starter to start to like have those conversations with your team, and then be able to kind of like keep that real human connection, right? Like if you're doing these things with Culture Amp, you're going to get anonymous survey numbers and things like that. But at the end of the day, as managers, we're not doing our jobs if we're taking those numbers and then just running the organization like paint by number management. We might as well let computers do our job, right? So
Exactly.
Trying to find those opportunities to make those connections and keep a pulse on the team.
Yeah, I love that. And I would say that at Karat, we extend that just a little bit. And I hope that we continue this process. But what I've noticed is a lot more folks in the organization are stepping up to share some of their passions that are available remotely. So for example, they're giving workout of the days to the team, from CrossFit, or some folks are having meditation sessions or play sessions remotely with their children, or, they're setting up a constant time to do yoga in the mornings together. And a lot of that was born out of this crisis. And I would say from a personal perspective, I'd love to see that continue, because I'm starting to see kind of cross-organizational bonds happen that wouldn't normally happen because folks don't interact every day. Are you seeing something like that at InVision?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd also even extend that further and say that a lot of encouragement for folks to do things like we're doing today, right? Like take the things that you have learned and, take opportunities and go and give back where you can. That's certainly helped like bring, again, that like sense of community and morale. Cause I mean, like you said, fully remote organization, we have a lot we can help folks understand. So, giving them the opportunity to share those things, it's important.
Well, we can't undervalue the virtual happy hours that are happening. So awesome. Skylar is asking, what are some of your favorite one-on-one questions? Do you have any tips for remote one-on-ones and remote relationship building?
Yeah. So I mentioned some of my favorites, obviously.
It's a great segue.
Q12 questions. Those are great. I think, when I look at some of my favorite one-on-ones are really the skip level one-on-ones that I do with the engineers, right? So I manage managers and then do skip levels with the engineers. Some of my go-to questions there are kind of, hey, like, is there anything that you want to know from me as a director, right? Like that you feel like you don't necessarily have a clear understanding about the company or the strategy. Like those are good segues, again, like to make sure that they're making a connection to the work that they're doing to the greater strategy in the company. And then they're also getting a chance to like get to know me and like learn more about who I am and vice versa, right? So that question, if there's like, tell me if there's anything that's like slowing you down in your job, right? Like what can I do as a director today to like help you be more productive? And where are the drags that I might not be seeing because I'm not on the front lines? And so that's a great question to even ask managers so that I can get like a pulse of where I need to take action, right? Because at the end of the day, like we need to build trust, right? So having those one-on-ones is going to get us getting to know each other, building trust, but then trust also requires us to take action on the things that we need to take action on. So that's kind of like, trying to give them an opportunity to build a relationship with the director, I think is a key element.
Yeah, and I think what I'd love to point out here, and often I get a lot of questions around one-on-ones and how they should be conducted, is it sounds, at least to me, that the one-on-one is focused on the employee, not on their tasks, but on their growth. And that's a philosophy that I like to follow, which is, in my one-on-ones, I hear about my employees and their employees' tasks every single day. Right? We know where projects are. They have to talk about it over and over again. So the one-on-one time really is just about their career trajectory and growth and how we can help. And also, like you said, making sure that they're getting the exposure that they need to feel comfortable and understand the broader picture. I've noticed, and maybe you can speak a little bit about this, that engineers aren't often exposed to kind of the business value that they're creating. There's this kind of weird commercial sales and marketing folks over here, and we're getting the work done. And often that lack of exposure can cause us to be a little bit frustrated. So do you also bring in kind of the company vision and the whys and other folks from other orgs?
100%. And we talk about that, like engineering managers and directors, like we are the hubs, right? And there's a lot of spokes going off of that in many directions. We're the ones interacting with almost the entire rest of the organization and bringing all of that context down to the engineers. And like, at the end of the day, like we don't want engineers to just be taking orders from us. That's not our goal, right? Like we need them to be autonomous and be able to make decisions in their day-to-day, and they can't do that if they don't have full context of what's happening throughout the organization. You know, some of the best remote managers that I've seen, they can do that and they bring that context in one-on-ones, but like one-on-ones, like, and I'm going to use this, and just like right now in this environment that we're in, we're trying to limit virality spread, right? Trying to like keep things locked into our homes right now so that things are not getting outside. And like when you have a one-on-one conversation, that's like kind of how far things go sometimes. So some of the best managers I've seen, especially working remotely, they'll take that context and that knowledge that they have of what's going on outside the organization or outside their team, and like write a blog post and then share that even publicly and share it with their team. But it kind of just allows that information to just go a little bit further than where it would in like a one-on-one interaction.
I love that. Yeah, don't let isolation let things fester. That's for sure. So Skylar is asking, what are some of your favorite, oh, well, no, we're done with that one. Excuse me. Noah is asking, what do you feel like are the biggest advantages of having a fully remote team? Are there aspects of being fully remote that make you wish you had an entire team in an office?
Interesting. So this is a tough question for me because I have never never managed a team in an office before. So my experience has been only doing fully remote. So when people ask me like the pros and cons and the advantages, I can only sort of imagine what that feels like, you know, when you're not managing a remote team. You know, I can tell you, you know, on the flip side of that, some of the disadvantages I see of having a fully remote team and kind of what it means to manage differently when you're managing remotely, right? You know, seeing InVision grow, I've definitely noticed that there's, you know, a lot of challenges, a lot of, you know, hyper growth problems that you're going to face as you're scaling out an organization. And a lot of these things aren't unique to being remote, but they can, like if you've got problems with trust or problems with like the sort of command and control versus like full autonomy that we were talking about, like those things are going to be exacerbated by going fully remote because you're not going to be able to hide those things very easily. And the one thing I tell people is like one of the major differences when you go fully remote is that if you don't have like genuine real talk communication with folks and you're like not providing a lot of that context and information that we were talking about, people will make it up. Like that's just how it kind of works in a remote environment. Like as soon as you and I, like as soon as we close down this Zoom session, it is literally just us in our own sort of like box and like echo chamber of our own thoughts. And so we will like come up with our own ideas about, you know, where we stand, you know, as individuals, where the company stands, where the product stands, things about our customers. So if you as a manager aren't constantly like reiterating with folks, like here is where they stand, here's what the company is about, here's what we're trying to do as, you know, for a strategy, there's like a half-life for every single piece of information that you put out there. And if you don't keep reiterating it, again, people are just going to like come up with their own ideas. And I've seen imposter syndrome is a huge problem inside remote organizations. So like, I think, you know, coming back to the question about fully advantage is like, it kind of forces you to hold communication to a higher standard inside the company.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, we have a question. It's not exactly a follow-up, but it is something that folks are running into and related. What do you do when a team you just joined is beginning to fall back and the engineers are not giving their best, especially in this environment because things have changed? We're supposed to conclude a sprint last week, but a certain engineer is not giving his best, and I can see him actively committing to side projects on GitHub. What can I do in this situation? And P.S., I'm the engineering manager on the team. So I think this does tie in a bit to that kind of remote environment and how to run effective remote environments. But we also touched on, you know, not being a micromanager as well, right? So perhaps you can speak to this a bit.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, on the topic of micromanagement, and even in this specific case, again, it's like, kind of what is this engineer, what are they, what are their specific goals? What are they trying to get out of the time? Oops, sorry. I was echoing for a second. Get out of their commitment to the organization, right? So just looking at, I'm suspecting, beginning to fall back. I'm curious kind of what fall back to some like poor habits or habits that are like prior to working remotely. That's I'm not quite sure what the motivation is behind the question.
Yeah, I think maybe this goes back to when we were speaking about setting success metrics and understanding of what success is within the organization. In a remote environment, especially if interviews, which is what we do, right? You have to make sure that people on the other side, they understand what your expectations are, that there's some consistency, clarity, and conversation. And then, then making sure that the person that you're speaking with understands what you were saying, right? So that there's no miscommunication there when it comes to their day-to-day work. But it is hard because, you in particular, restrictions are tough, right? So you don't want to restrict people and micromanage them, because then people get frustrated by the restriction of tools that may increase their own personal collaboration. And so my feedback would always be, let's set up some success metrics. Let's, understand in our one-on-ones where this person's head at. Potentially there are a few reasons. Maybe, they don't feel like the senior management team is communicating, very clearly with them, and they don't understand where the company is going. Often when people don't feel there's a North Star, they start to kind of go in a lot of different directions, and that removes that cohesiveness and that kind of moving forward as a team and excitement about a product. So those are the types of things that I would employ. I don't know if you want to speak to any of those. How do you keep your team kind of going in the right direction, especially during these times? I know you're always remote, so it's second nature, but maybe there's some basics that our friend can employ.
Yeah, again, kind of coming back to, like you said, sort of setting expectations, setting goals. If you're in a kind of command and control environment, trying to dictate everything that they're doing, that's usually, in my experience, not going to work when you're fully remote. You have to build off that sort of basis of trust that, they know how their work is connected to our particular goals and our OKRs, right? So coming back to reiterating, here's where we're going, here's what we're trying to get out of the company. Do you, like I said, the sort of the Gallup Q12 questions even touch on this as well. Like how do you feel about the success of the company? Is that kind of what is going at the root of this issue? Like I said, yeah, I don't know. This is one of those questions that doing this differently in this time and age, like with the pandemic, it's certainly something that you just don't know how people are reacting right now. The emotional things that they're going through, every single day is like an emotional roller coaster. You watch the news. And so just, again, like you got to have a conversation with these people specifically and kind of figure out what they're going through, how they're feeling about it. Hopefully it's not something that's more systemic. Hopefully it is something that's just, right now they've got kids at home and they don't know what to do, right? So yeah, try to be supportive as much as you can, and like let them know that you are here to help and that you trust them to do the job. And like you said, set expectations, but also, like, again, recognize that we're all in a different world right now, right? So we do kind of have to curb our expectations a little.
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday a little bit about assuming the best in some ways, right? Creating a safe environment for folks to reach out and give you kind of the root of the issues that they're dealing with, rather than you just seeing the symptoms as as bad behavior or something negative.
Yep.
Exactly. Okay, so JT is asking, when not dealing with a pandemic, how do you approach getting your team together in person? Do you do like full engineering org meetups, smaller meetings with just smaller project squads, or some combination of both throughout the year? And how important have you found in-person meetups to be for morale and connection and alignment?
Great question. So before we had a travel ban, we've done this a lot of different ways in the companies that I've worked in, and they're absolutely vital for connection, building empathy, and honestly, like when we do get together, one of the things that we say is like, if you are trying to do like the real day-to-day work while you're while you're in an offsite, like we're failing. Like that's like, we're just not going to be able to scale. So we try to make these offsite events, and we oscillate between onsite or offsite. What word do you use? We try to make them more about the connection. So doing things like, I mean, I did curling this year for the first time. I've never done curling. It's extremely fun, but we did it on an offsite. And axe throwing, right? We try to find these like activities to do things on the offsites. In terms of structures that have worked really well, InVision has done all company offsites that have worked really well. You do them over a course of a couple of days, and kind of what we found is that like 3-4 days is kind of the max that people can like kind of stand. Like doing a whole week is going to be too long. Like it's like sensory overload for a lot of us, you know, because you're always on. And we've also done things where, you know, taking a specific team, letting them have an offsite, but then doing it with one other team, so that you're fostering more of a connection across the organization, and giving people opportunities to get to know themselves outside of their team, and just kind of getting more of that like cultural understanding as well.
Yeah, I will second the no more than 3 or 4 days for the offsites. It gets exhausting. Folks want to get home to their families, but it is important. At Karat, we do meet quarterly, and it's fun. We also have really fun, exciting new excursions every single time, and it does help. This is a great question around productivity, and I think you'll understand more than anyone how to answer, but do you foresee an impact on productivity as lots going around the environment community and might be within your family? Do we need to adjust, most importantly, I think, do we need to adjust the velocity for team members at this point? So a more tactical question.
Absolutely. This is something that I'm advising all of our team, like even when we were talking about like our quarterly OKRs. Currently we're feeling like pretty on track, but we don't even know kind of how some of these things are going to impact our velocity until we see that impact, right? Like most of us, this is like week 2, right? So it's going to take us time to really even know how our velocity is impacted, but absolutely recognizing that we have to account for the new distractions and limited velocity that we have.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. We do have a question around interviews. How do you run I have a feeling you've been doing this for some time. Do you do all on-site interview processes, or do you all remote, or do you have a combination when you're interviewing right now?
It is all remote.
Right.
Well, we also use Karat for our technical interviews.
And I promise this isn't a Karat person asking. We have a fundamental question. How do you run remote interviews that usually require whiteboards for explaining complex systems while doing tech background check or applying questions about systems design? Do you ask the candidate to use any diagram or flow charting tools?
So we typically use tools like CoderPad, right? Where it's collaborative, even just like pseudocode or anything like that. Typically, we found that like doing collaborative real-time typing and describing your concepts through words and even like pseudocode are a lot easier for folks than trying to do like collaborative diagrams or flowcharts. I mean, then you gotta kind of learn the tool and the process if you're not familiar with it. A lot of these tools are very intuitive, but it does put people on a little bit of a defensive, like I'm unfamiliar with this tool. But CoderPad is a great tool for doing technical interviews and doing a sort of pair programming as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I apologize for the unexpected plug. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good conversation. So one thing that we've learned, and we have done over 60,000 remote interviews, I think at this point, and our interview engineers have learned that first, interviews remotely get better with over time. So, go in, have some kind of measurements that you're looking for, a consistent idea of what everybody's going to be interviewing for. Make sure that the people that you're speaking with understand the expectations and the language that you're using, and understand how they're going to be measured in the conversation so that they can relax. The other piece is what we were talking about earlier is just, when you're getting started, have a conversation. Start with 5 minutes introduction. Make sure that that person, if you can, give them access to CoderPad before the interview process. Give them access to CoderPad, have them go in and get comfortable with the environment. We all know as developers, it's like getting in somebody else's car and driving when you're going into a new IDE. So, make sure that before the interview process that the engineers and the candidates have access to the environment that they'll be in. And I guess, just the most important is clarity, especially remotely. Again, you don't have the ability to pick up on those normal in-person social cues. So just being very clear about success, being very clear about your expectations, and being very clear about what you're measuring is very important.
Yeah, I'll extend that for sure. I mean, setting expectations up front, to your point, like even simple things like saying this is going to be a video interview, and helping them say like, hey, I want you to do your best to get on a good internet connection, have a camera, a good microphone. Like setting those expectations up front are going to help you have a better interview. Just in terms of like tips and around the experience, like recognize, especially for fully remote companies, and now like you're going to engage people and they're going to come into your environment. They're going to be working fully remote. Like what you experience on an interview, they're going to take away as like how your culture operates and like how like connect that whole sort of realm, right? So I tell people, like when I first start interviewing them, I set expectations of like, hey, like we're going to cover a lot today. I've got a lot of questions and I want to give you time to ask me questions. But like I use my hands, by the way. I use my hands a lot just to like help accentuate emotions, to give them that connection, help them realize that like, hey, I'm not just this like stodgy stoic, all right, next question, what, how do you feel about this? Like trying to be a little bit more dynamic allows them to break down a little bit more of the like comfort, uncomfortableness that they might have. And then I tell people like, hey, when you interview remotely, for whatever reason, people have a tendency to like go on and ramble a lot in interviews. And I think it's because of your point, like they don't necessarily pick up on the cues of like, okay, we're good, I got it. So I set expectations right up front and say like, hey, I hope it's okay. I may interrupt you at any given time. And I'll put my hand up and I'll say like, this is good, that's great. Like, don't take this personally as if you like failed that question. This is just like our way of making sure that we can continue on that conversation. And I tell them, feel free to interrupt me at any time too, if I happen to go off and ramble.
Yeah, I love that. You're touching on a very important point. It's so important to be friendly in these environments, especially remote. It's such a nerve-wracking experience, and those interpersonal skills are key. And it's really important to represent your company in a positive light. I mean, these are folks you may be working with, and you may get excited about a candidate and want to geek out, do it. Right? If you want to ask a system design question, you want to geek out with them, do it. Just make sure you're not inserting your own personal kind of biases towards a solution and enabling them to kind of give their best selves.
Yeah, you touched on bias, and certainly when training for doing remote interviews, I definitely recommend bias training. I have seen like, listen, it's hard to make connections with people, and it's especially hard to make connections with people like remotely over video that you've just met. And so there is a danger that like you connect with people that are more like you because you'll identify with them. So just make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you are interviewing, especially remotely. I've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah, and do you internally use like a more structured scoring rubric that all the developers or folks who are going to be interviewing decide on beforehand to avoid that?
We do. We use tools like Greenhouse, have a standard scorecard, and part of that does include like, have a panel of interviewers, and we make sure that we have a diverse group of folks with different backgrounds and different ideas, so that we do kind of help against that bias. Yeah.
Well, Mustafa, we have about 2 minutes. There are a few more questions. Shall I keep going, or did you have anything that you wanted to touch on before we?
Yeah, I do want to. I'll have some closing remarks. Maybe let's do one quick answer, if that's okay. Maybe whatever the top question.
The top question left is: how do you make sure you are not overburdening teams with too many meetings to help with team cohesion, like virtual happy hours and such?
Yeah. So meeting fatigue is certainly a thing when working fully remote. Definitely recommend doing like a regular audit on your meetings. And even like when you have a meeting, asking at the end of the meeting, like, hey, should we continue having this particular meeting, right? More often than not, like we try to get into a cadence of meetings, right? So there's a set sort of like, on a bi-weekly bi-weekly, we're going to have sprint planning and like create your rituals and make sure you've got those cadences. And that way, when you're doing ad hoc meetings that aren't these regular meetings, you have a sense of like what's going on and how many meetings you are having. I would recommend tools like Clockwise that are really good at tracking and helping like even rearrange meetings to avoid that fatigue and creating focus time. Another tool that I've used with great success is the auto decline meetings tool inside Google Calendar. Like if you put a no meetings day event, all day event on your calendar, it'll just automatically decline anything that comes in. That way you have a little bit more control over it. But also just even reviewing like your personal commitments. If you find yourself in having a lot of meetings, like make sure you look at like, hey, like, am I taking on more roles or more responsibilities than I should? So definitely this is an issue. We certainly try to do a lot of our happy hour kind of things during office hours so that people don't feel like they have to take time out of their social lives to do it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ryan. We really appreciate your time today. And thank you all who have joined us. We're very also appreciative of your time during these times. Mustafa, I will give it back to you.
Yeah, in the final minute, just want to say again, thanks to Ryan from InVision and Shannon from Karat. And then also we'll be sending out an email with a few little things. So we'll send you a recording of this webinar that we'd love for you to pass on to your colleagues, your teammates. So we'll send a recording of the webinar. We'll also be sending you a promo code if you want to check out our mentorship platform. Again, we're the biggest mentorship platform for engineering managers and product managers, so check it out. And we'll also send some details on the next webinar. It's another Ask Me Anything session. It's an AMA with the VP of Engineering at GitHub, Dana Lawson. So excited to share all that. We'll do that soon. And we hope you'll stay safe and healthy. So thanks again. Take care, everyone.